The year is 1953, and in the halls of the Kremlin, the most powerful man in the Soviet Union lies dying. Joseph Stalin, the iron-fisted leader who had ruled over one-sixth of the world's landmass for nearly 3 decades, suffers a cerebral hemorrhage in his dacha at Kuntsevo. His guards, terrified of entering his room without permission, wait for hours before checking on him. When they finally do, they find him collapsed on the floor, partially paralyzed and unable to speak. The man who had orchestrated the deaths of millions, who had survived assassination plots, purges, and a world war, is finally vulnerable. Yet even in this moment of weakness, even as his body fails him, the system he built continues to function with mechanical precision. This scene raises a question that haunted Soviet officials, foreign intelligence agencies, and millions of Soviet citizens for decades. Why was Stalin so extraordinarily difficult to overthrow? To understand the answer, we must first recognize that Stalin's grip on power was not the result of a single mechanism or strategy, but rather an intricate web of interconnected systems, each reinforcing the others, each designed to eliminate any possibility of organized resistance. His rule represented perhaps the most comprehensive totalitarian control system ever constructed, one that penetrated every layer of Soviet society from the highest echelons of the Communist Party to the most remote collective farms in Siberia. The architecture of this power was built methodically over 25 years, from his consolidation of control after Lenin's death in 1924 to the height of his authority in the late 1940s. Each brick in this edifice served a purpose, and each was cemented with blood. The foundation of Stalin's unshakable position was laid in the years immediately following the Russian Revolution. While Lenin still lived, Stalin occupied a position that seemed unremarkable to many of his more charismatic rivals: General Secretary of the Communist Party. Appointed to this role in 1922, Stalin understood something that his competitors, brilliant theorists like Leon Trotsky and Grigory Zinoviev, failed to grasp. In a revolutionary state, where the party controlled everything, the person who controlled the party's administrative machinery controlled the revolution itself. As General Secretary, Stalin had the authority to appoint officials at every level of the party hierarchy. He could place loyalists in key positions, transfer troublesome officials to remote postings, and gradually build a network of men who owed their careers entirely to him. Between 1922 and 1928, Stalin systematically filled the party apparatus with his supporters. He promoted men from humble backgrounds, often from Georgia and other Caucasus regions, who had no independent power base and whose loyalty was personal rather than ideological. These appointments seemed mundane at the time, bureaucratic shuffling that attracted little attention from the more prominent Bolsheviks who were busy debating the finer points of Marxist theory. But when Lenin died in January 1924, Stalin's careful preparation paid dividends. The party congresses that would determine Lenin's successor were attended by delegates who had been selected, directly or indirectly, by Stalin himself. When votes were counted, Stalin's candidates won. When opposition factions tried to rally support, they discovered that the party members they needed to convince were already committed to Stalin. The elimination of his rivals followed a pattern that would become Stalin's signature method. He never moved against all his enemies simultaneously. Instead, he formed temporary alliances with some to destroy others, then turned on his former allies once they had served their purpose. First, he allied with Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev to marginalize Trotsky, the brilliant military commander of the Red Army whose prestige and intellectual authority made him Lenin's apparent heir. By 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the party and exiled to Kazakhstan, eventually forced to leave the Soviet Union entirely in 1929. Then Stalin turned on Zinoviev and Kamenev, accusing them of factionalism and removing them from positions of power. By 1929, Stalin stood supreme, but his position was not yet unassailable. The real consolidation of power, the creation of a system that made him virtually impossible to remove, came in the following decade through mechanisms far more brutal and comprehensive. The collectivization of agriculture, launched in 1929, served multiple purposes in Stalin's consolidation of power. On the surface, it was an economic policy designed to modernize Soviet agriculture and extract resources to fund rapid industrialization. In reality, it was also a political weapon aimed at destroying the last significant social group in the Soviet Union that existed outside direct party control: the kulaks, or relatively prosperous peasants. The collectivization campaign forcibly seized land and livestock from millions of peasant families, herding them into collective farms where production quotas were set by the state. Those who resisted were declared enemies of the people. Between 1930 and 1933, approximately 6 million people died in the resulting famines, with Ukraine suffering particularly catastrophic losses in what became known as the Holodomor. The political effect of this catastrophe was to eliminate any possibility of rural resistances to Stalin's rule and to make the entire Soviet population dependent on the state-controlled distribution system for their basic survival. When the state controlled all food production and distribution, opposition became not just dangerous, but potentially suicidal. Simultaneously, Stalin's industrialization drive, embodied in the successive 5-year plans beginning in 1928, restructured Soviet society in ways that reinforced his control. Millions of peasants were pulled from the countryside into new industrial cities built around massive factories and construction projects. These workers were completely dependent on state employment, state housing, and state rations. They had no alternative sources of income, no private property to fall back on, and no social structures outside those created and monitored by the party. The industrialization campaign also created a new class of industrial managers and technical specialists whose positions depended entirely on their loyalty to Stalin's policies. Any manager who failed to meet production quotas, regardless of whether those quotas were realistic, could be accused of sabotage and arrested. This system ensured that the entire economic apparatus of the Soviet Union was bound to Stalin through chains of fear and dependency. But economic control and bureaucratic manipulation alone do not explain why Stalin proved so difficult to overthrow. The truly distinctive feature of his rule was the systematic use of terror as an instrument of governance, reaching its apex in the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938. The purges began with the assassination of Sergei Kirov, the popular Leningrad party boss, in December 1934. Whether Stalin ordered this killing remains debated, but he certainly exploited it ruthlessly, using Kirov's death as justification for a massive expansion of the security apparatus and the beginning of show trials targeting supposed conspirators. In August 1936, the first major show trial convicted Zinoviev, Kamenev, and 14 others of plotting with Trotsky to assassinate Soviet leaders. All were executed. In January 1937, a second trial targeted Karl Radek and other prominent Bolsheviks. In March 1938, Nikolai Bukharin, once called the darling of the party, was tried and executed along with other alleged members of a bloc of rights and Trotskyites. These spectacular public trials were merely the visible surface of a much deeper and more comprehensive terror. Throughout 1937 and 1938, Stalin directed a systematic purge of the entire Soviet elite. The military suffered catastrophic losses. 3 of 5 marshals were executed, 13 of 15 army commanders, 57 of 85 corps commanders, and 110 of 195 division commanders. The Navy lost all 8 of its admirals. These were not symbolic purges. They were the physical elimination of the entire high command of the Red Army, men who had fought in the Civil War and who possessed both military expertise and the loyalty of their troops. By executing these officers, Stalin removed the only group with the organizational capacity and armed force necessary to mount a coup. The purges extended throughout the party apparatus as well. In the Communist Party Central Committee elected at the 17th Party Congress in 1934, 98 of the 139 members were arrested and shot. Of the 1,966 delegates to that same Congress, over half were arrested for counter-revolutionary crimes. The mechanism of the purge was designed to be self-perpetuating and to prevent any possibility of organized resistance. Arrests typically occurred at night. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police headed by Nikolai Yezhov and later by Lavrenti Beria, would take individuals from their homes without warning. Those arrested were pressured through torture, sleep deprivation, and threats to their families to confess to fantastic conspiracies and to name accomplices. Each person named would be arrested in turn, creating an ever-expanding web of accusations. The system operated on quotas. Regional NKVD offices were given targets for numbers of arrests and executions, ensuring that the terror would continue regardless of whether actual opposition existed. This created a climate in which no one could trust anyone else. A casual comment, a joke, even silence could be interpreted as evidence of counter-revolutionary sentiment. Family members denounced each other. Colleagues informed on their co-workers. Children were encouraged to report their parents. The psychological impact of this system cannot be overstated. In a society where anyone could be arrested at any time for any reason or no reason at all, where torture would force confessions to crimes never committed, where the accused had no legal protections and no possibility of genuine defense, the rational response was absolute conformity and absolute silence regarding any doubts about the leadership. The purges created what historian Robert Conquest called a preemptive terror, where people policed their own thoughts and behaviors because the consequences of even perceived disloyalty were so severe. This extended even to the highest levels of the party. Members of the Politburo, Stalin's inner circle, lived in constant fear. They never knew when Stalin might turn on them, when a summons to his office might result in arrest rather than a policy discussion. This fear paralyzed potential opposition before it could even form. Stalin reinforced this system of terror with a cult of personality unprecedented in its scope and intensity. Beginning in the early 1930s and reaching its height after the victory in the Second World War, Stalin was portrayed as an infallible genius, the greatest leader in Soviet history, the brilliant strategist who had led the country through industrialization and collectivization, who had defeated fascism, who understood the laws of history with scientific precision. His image was everywhere, in posters, statues, paintings, films, and literature. Cities were renamed in his honor: Stalingrad, Stalino, Stalinabad, and dozens of others. The national anthem adopted in 1944 praised him by name. Every success was attributed to his wisdom. Every failure was blamed on saboteurs and wreckers who had betrayed his perfect plans. This cult served multiple functions. It made criticism of Stalin equivalent to criticism of the Soviet Union itself, making opposition not just dangerous, but ideologically treasonous. It also created a psychological barrier to resistance when an entire society is organized around the premise that one man is uniquely qualified to lead. The act of opposing him requires not just courage, but a fundamental reimagining of political reality. The Second World War, despite its catastrophic cost, ultimately strengthened rather than weakened Stalin's position. The initial period of the war was disastrous for the Soviet Union. Stalin's purge of the military leadership left the Red Army unprepared for the German invasion in June 1941. His refusal to heed warnings about the impending attack, his disastrous orders in the first weeks of the war, and his initial paralysis as German forces advanced rapidly toward Moscow revealed the flaws in his leadership. In those early months, there was a moment when Stalin's position might have been vulnerable. In late June 1941, he retreated to his dacha, apparently expecting to be arrested or removed from power. But when a delegation from the Politburo arrived, they came not to depose him, but to ask him to lead the newly formed State Defense Committee. The system he had built was so thoroughly centered on his person that even in the face of catastrophic failure, the remaining leadership could not imagine functioning without him. As the war progressed and the Soviet Union began to push back the German invasion, Stalin positioned himself as the architect of victory. The successful defense of Moscow in December 1941, the turning point at Stalingrad in 1942 and 43, and the subsequent Soviet advance toward Berlin were all credited to Stalin's strategic genius. The role of competent military commanders like Georgy Zhukov was downplayed. Stalin was portrayed as the mastermind behind every victory. When the war ended in May 1945 with Soviet forces occupying Berlin and much of Eastern Europe, Stalin's prestige was at its zenith. He was not just the leader of the Soviet Union, but the victor over fascism, one of the most powerful men in the world. The suffering the Soviet people had endured during the war, the 27 million dead, the destroyed cities and devastated countryside, all of this was transformed in official propaganda into proof of the Soviet people's devotion to Stalin and his leadership. The post-war period saw no relaxation of Stalin's control. If anything, his grip tightened. Returning Soviet prisoners of war, who had seen life in the West even as prisoners, were treated with suspicion. Many were sent directly to the Gulag labor camp system, accused of collaboration or ideological contamination. Entire ethnic groups that Stalin suspected of disloyalty during the war, including the Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, and Volga Germans, were forcibly deported to Central Asia and Siberia in brutal operations that killed tens of thousands. In 1948, Stalin launched a new campaign against rootless cosmopolitans, a thinly veiled anti-Semitic purge targeting Jewish intellectuals, doctors, and officials. The Doctors' Plot of 1952, in which prominent physicians, most of them Jewish, were accused of plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders, suggested that Stalin was preparing another major purge, similar to that of 1937 and 38. Only his death in March 1953 prevented what might have been another wave of mass terror. The institutional structures Stalin created to maintain his power were equally important as the terror itself. The Soviet system under Stalin was characterized by what scholars call institutional redundancy and rivalry. Multiple organizations had overlapping responsibilities, ensuring that no single institution could become powerful enough to challenge Stalin. The party, the government ministries, the military, and the secret police all had separate hierarchies, and Stalin played them against each other. He would assign the same task to different organizations, then reward whichever completed it most effectively, creating constant competition and preventing any unified opposition. The secret police itself went through multiple reorganizations, from the OGPU to the NKVD to the MGB, with periodic purges of its leadership. Genrikh Yagoda, head of the NKVD during the early purges, was arrested and executed in 1938. His successor, Nikolai Yezhov, was arrested in 1939 and executed in 1940. This constant turnover ensured that even the chiefs of the secret police, who wielded enormous power, never felt secure enough to plot against Stalin. Stalin's control over information was another crucial element. The Soviet Union under his rule was a closed society. Foreign travel was virtually impossible for ordinary citizens. Foreign publications were banned. Radio broadcasts from outside the Soviet Union were jammed. The press, literature, film, and all forms of public communication were subject to strict censorship. This information monopoly meant that Soviet citizens had no way to compare their conditions with those in other countries, no way to organize opposition based on alternative political ideas, and no independent sources of information that might contradict official propaganda. Even within the leadership, Stalin controlled the flow of information. He decided what information reached the Politburo, what intelligence reports were circulated, what economic data was reliable. This allowed him to shape the reality that even his closest associates perceived, making it difficult for them to develop an independent assessment of situations that might lead them to question his decisions. The geographic and demographic scale of the Soviet Union also worked in Stalin's favor. The USSR covered 11 time zones and included over 100 distinct ethnic groups. This diversity made unified opposition extremely difficult. Stalin exploited ethnic tensions, playing different groups against each other, deporting entire populations, and ensuring that no single ethnic or regional identity could become a rallying point for resistance. The sheer size of the country meant that even if opposition emerged in one region, the vast distances and poor communications made it nearly impossible to coordinate with potential allies elsewhere. The Gulag system itself, with camps scattered across the most remote regions of Siberia and Central Asia, served not just as punishment, but as a means of dispersing potential opposition, breaking up any groups that might form, and ensuring that dissidents were isolated from the general population. Perhaps most fundamentally, Stalin was difficult to overthrow because he had systematically eliminated everyone who had the combination of position, capability, and will to challenge him. The old Bolsheviks who had made the revolution, who had independent prestige and revolutionary credentials, were dead, executed during the purges. The military commanders who had led the Red Army to victory in the Civil War were dead. The intellectuals who might have articulated an alternative vision were dead in the Gulag or thoroughly cowed. By the late 1940s, the entire Soviet elite consisted of people who had risen to power during Stalin's rule, who owed their positions entirely to him, and who had survived by demonstrating absolute loyalty. These were not people likely to risk everything by plotting against the man who had made their careers possible and who could destroy them with a word. When Stalin finally died on March 5, 1953, the system he had built outlasted him, at least initially. His immediate successors, led by Georgy Malenkov, Nikita Khrushchev, and Lavrenti Beria, maintained the basic structures of Soviet power even as they maneuvered against each other. The fact that Beria, the feared chief of the secret police, was arrested and executed by his colleagues in June 1953 shows that the post-Stalin leadership had learned from Stalin's methods, using similar tactics of sudden arrest and show trials to eliminate threats. Khrushchev's eventual victory in the succession struggle and his famous secret speech in 1956 denouncing Stalin's crimes represented a partial repudiation of Stalinist terror. But the fundamental structures of the Soviet system, the one-party state, the command economy, the restrictions on freedom, remained in place until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The question of why Stalin was so hard to overthrow reveals something profound about the nature of totalitarian power. Stalin's system was not simply a matter of one man's ruthlessness or paranoia, though he possessed both qualities in abundance. It was a comprehensive architecture of control that operated at every level of society simultaneously. Economic dependency created through collectivization and state ownership, political control through the party apparatus, physical terror through the secret police, psychological manipulation through propaganda and the cult of personality, institutional rivalry that prevented any organization from becoming too powerful, information control that prevented the formation of alternative narratives, and the systematic elimination of anyone with the capability to lead opposition. Each element reinforced the others, creating a system that was, for practical purposes, impossible to challenge from within. The legacy of this system extends far beyond Stalin's death or even the collapse of the Soviet Union. The methods Stalin perfected for maintaining power have been studied and adapted by authoritarian regimes around the world. The combination of economic control, security apparatus, propaganda, and systematic elimination of potential rivals can be seen in various forms in multiple countries today. Understanding why Stalin was so difficult to overthrow is not merely an exercise in historical analysis. It is a study in how power can be consolidated and maintained through the deliberate construction of systems that make opposition not just dangerous, but nearly impossible. The lesson of Stalin's rule is that totalitarian control, once fully established, becomes self-perpetuating, requiring not constant intervention from the dictator, but rather the mechanical operation of institutions designed to preserve the status quo. Stalin built a machine that ran on fear, and that machine continued to function even as its creator lay dying, unable to speak, surrounded by subordinates too terrified to act without his orders. That image of absolute power, maintained even in absolute weakness, remains one of the most chilling achievements of 20th century political history.